The champagne in Taylor's crystal flute suddenly tasted like battery acid. For 2 years, he had been the architect of his own elite narrative, having shed his boring, cardigan-wearing wife, Tabitha, to upgrade to a younger, flashier model who understood the ruthless game of high society networking. His colleagues had clapped him on the back. Everyone had laughed at how long it took him to drop the dead weight. But tonight, standing in the marble foyer of the most reclusive billionaire in Silicon Valley, the laughter died in his throat. The elusive host had finally appeared on the grand staircase, and walking arm in arm with him, radiant, commanding, and adorned in diamonds that could buy Taylor's entire firm, was Tabitha. The divorce party was held at a penthouse in San Francisco's Soma district, paid for by Taylor Pendleton's newly acquired bonus from Meridian Capital. The bass from the sound system vibrated through the floorboards, syncing perfectly with the triumphant beating of Taylor's heart. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering skyline, holding a tumbler of 20-year-old scotch. Beside him stood Chloe Sinclair, a 26-year-old public relations executive whose Instagram following was as curated and aggressive as her ambition. "To Taylor," declared David Kensington, one of the senior partners at Meridian, raising his glass high enough to catch the ambient violet lighting. A man who finally realized that a Ferrari engine shouldn't be strapped to a minivan. The room erupted in laughter and the clinking of heavy glassware. Taylor smiled, wrapping an arm around Chloe's waist, pulling her close. She smelled of expensive vanilla and victory. "It's about synergy, David," Taylor replied smoothly. "You can't build an empire if your partner's idea of a thrilling Friday night is cataloging tea leaves and going to bed by 9. I needed someone who matches my velocity." Everyone agreed. For years, Tabitha had been the punchline of Taylor's corporate circle. When they had met in college, her quiet, studious nature had been a grounding force for Taylor's chaotic ambition. But as Taylor climbed the vicious ladder of venture capital, Tabitha had remained exactly who she was, a methodical, deeply introverted archivist, specializing in rare European manuscripts. To Taylor, she was an embarrassment. At corporate dinners, while the other wives discussed luxury real estate in Aspen or private schools in Marin County, Tabitha would sit in excruciating silence, occasionally attempting to steer the conversation toward historical preservation or classical literature. Taylor remembered the final straw perfectly. It was a dinner with the CEO of a major tech conglomerate. Taylor had prepped Tabitha for hours, begging her to be charming. Instead, when asked about her passions, Tabitha had launched into a 20-minute, highly technical explanation of the chemical degradation of 15th-century vellum. The CEO's eyes had glazed over. Taylor had lost the account. The divorce had been swift, cold, and brutally one-sided. Taylor had expected Tabitha to weep, to beg, to cling to the comfortable life his salary provided. Instead, she had sat in her lawyer's office wearing a plain beige trench coat, her hair tied in an unceremonious bun, and calmly signed the papers. She didn't fight for the Tesla. She didn't fight for the modern loft. She only asked for her extensive collection of antique books, her antique writing desk, and a modest lump sum that barely put a dent in Taylor's portfolio. She didn't even shed a tear, Taylor had complained to Chloe later that night, feeling oddly insulted by his ex-wife's lack of hysterics. "It's like she has ice water in her veins. Or maybe she's just completely hollow." "She's just small-minded, babe," Chloe had purred, tracing the lapel of his tailored suit. "Some people are meant to be background extras in life. You're the leading man. You need a leading lady." Now, 3 months post-divorce, Taylor felt lighter than air. He was free. He was on the fast track to a senior partnership. He had a beautiful woman on his arm who knew exactly how to work a room, and he had completely erased Tabitha's beige, dusty existence from his pristine, glass and steel reality. As the party raged on around him, Taylor took a sip of his scotch, utterly convinced that he had won the game of life. He didn't know that the board was about to be flipped entirely. Underscore, 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 underscore. Across the bay, in a small, damp cottage in Berkeley, the air smelled of rain, steeped chamomile, and the distinct, intoxicating scent of decaying paper. Tabitha Hayes sat at her antique oak desk, the soft glow of a brass reading lamp illuminating the delicate, spidery script of a ledger dated 1492. She wasn't crying over Taylor. In fact, she hadn't shed a single tear since the day he brought up the word divorce. For Tabitha, the end of her marriage wasn't a tragedy. It was a slow, quiet release from a cage she hadn't fully realized she was trapped in. For 6 years, she had shrunk herself, muting her brilliance, softening her intellect, so that Taylor's fragile ego could take center stage. She had worn dull colors to fade into the background. She had swallowed her words to avoid outshining his shallow corporate anecdotes. Now, in the sanctuary of her own space, Tabitha was breathing for the first time in a decade. Her hands, encased in white cotton archivist gloves, delicately turned a crumbling page. Tabitha was a freelance authenticator. It wasn't a lucrative job by Silicon Valley standards, but she possessed a hyper-specific, genius-level intellect for linguistic anomalies and historical cryptography. Museums and private collectors occasionally sent her scans of documents they couldn't decipher. 2 weeks ago, a package had arrived via secure courier. There was no return address, only a heavy wax-sealed envelope and a digital tablet locked behind a biometric scan that the courier facilitated. Inside the tablet were high-resolution scans of a journal entirely written in a cipher that had baffled historians for over a century, the rumored Vesper Codex, an intellectual holy grail believed to have been penned by a rogue Renaissance architect who designed secret vaults for European royalty. The note accompanying the tablet was brief, typed on heavy, unmarked cardstock. Dr. Harrison Gable suggested you are the only mind in North America capable of seeing the pattern. My client requires your discretion and your brilliance. Compensation is unlimited. Tabitha had smiled. Dr. Gable was her former university mentor, a man who knew the depths of her capabilities far better than her ex-husband ever had. For 14 days and nights, Tabitha barely slept. She immersed herself in the cipher. Where others saw random, chaotic symbols, Tabitha's mind, freed from the daily emotional exhaustion of managing Taylor's neuroses, began to see the mathematical rhythm of the text. It wasn't just a language. It was a map. It was a 3-dimensional architectural blueprint hidden within a 2-dimensional language. On a Tuesday at 3 a.m., the final piece clicked into place. She had broken the Vesper Codex. She compiled her findings into a meticulously detailed 70-page report and transmitted it back through the secure channel provided. She expected a polite email of thanks and perhaps a wire transfer of a few $1,000s. Instead, 48 hours later, a sleek black Maybach pulled up to her cottage. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, holding a silver tray. On it rested a single, heavy black envelope with gold foil lettering. "Miss Hayes," the man said, his tone steeped in deep respect. "My employer is profoundly moved by your work. He requests the absolute honor of your presence this weekend in Carmel by the Sea. A wardrobe has been arranged, as he is aware of the short notice." Tabitha opened the envelope. The invitation was for the Sterling Solstice Gala. Even Tabitha, disconnected as she was from the corporate gossip mill, knew the name Silas Sterling. He was a titan, an eccentric billionaire who had made his fortune in early tech infrastructure and then retreated from the public eye to amass the world's most significant private collection of historical antiquities. He was notoriously reclusive, highly intellectual, and ruthlessly selective about his company. Getting an invitation to his estate was equivalent to a knighthood in modern American high society. Tabitha looked at her reflection in the cottage window. She saw the pale, tired woman Taylor had discarded. Then she looked down at the gold foil invitation. A slow, dangerous spark ignited in her chest. "Tell your employer," Tabitha said, her voice steady and clear, "that I accept." The transformation wasn't a cliché montage of makeup and hair extensions. It was an internal unearthing. When Tabitha arrived at the private boutique in San Francisco, prepaid by the Sterling estate, she bypassed the flashy sequined gowns that women like Chloe wore. Instead, she chose a custom-tailored, floor-length gown of deep, midnight blue silk. It was structured, architectural, and completely unbothered by current fleeting trends. It was a dress for a queen, not a concubine. She let her hair fall in soft, natural waves, and for the first time in years, she stood up, entirely straight. She wasn't Taylor Pendleton's boring wife anymore. She was Tabitha Hayes, the woman who had conquered the Vesper Codex. Underscore, 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 underscore. Taylor was sweating through his bespoke Tom Ford suit. The temperature in the Maybach was perfectly regulated at 68 degrees, but a cold prickle of anxiety was crawling up his spine. "Stop fidgeting, Taylor," Chloe snapped, adjusting the plunging neckline of her aggressively red dress. "You're going to wrinkle the jacket. And remember, when we see Silas, you let me do the softening up before you pitch Meridian." Taylor grunted, staring out the window at the winding, foggy coastal roads of Carmel by the Sea. Getting this invitation had cost him nearly every favor, connection, and ounce of leverage he possessed. He had practically blackmailed a lower-level associate of the Sterling estate just to get a +2 pass to the Solstice Gala. Meridian Capital was bleeding money, and Taylor's promised senior partnership was contingent on one thing: securing Silas Sterling as an anchor investor for their new tech infrastructure fund. If Taylor failed tonight, his career wouldn't just stall, it would plummet. The Maybach passed through massive wrought-iron gates, flanked by security personnel who looked more like private military contractors than valets. The Sterling estate was a sprawling, modern fortress of glass, stone, and reclaimed wood, perched perilously on the edge of a cliff overlooking the churning Pacific Ocean. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the loud, obnoxious tech parties Taylor was used to. There was no blaring bass, no neon lights. Instead, a string quartet played softly in a corner. Waiters in white coats carried trays of vintage champagne and caviar. The guests were a terrifyingly elite mixture of old money, supreme political power, and quiet, world-altering tech pioneers. Taylor felt entirely out of his depth. He immediately grabbed 2 glasses of champagne, downing one instantly to calm his nerves. "Look," Chloe whispered, pointing a manicured finger toward the far end of the grand hall. "That's him." Silas Sterling was an imposing figure. In his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and sharp, piercing blue eyes, he exuded an aura of absolute authority. He wore a simple, unstructured black velvet jacket over a dark turtleneck, looking perfectly at ease while the billionaires around him clamored for his attention. Taylor took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and began to weave his way through the crowd, dragging Chloe by the hand. He rehearsed his pitch in his head. "Silas, Taylor Pendleton, Meridian Capital. I know you value infrastructure, and we have a portfolio that—" Before Taylor could breach the inner circle, a melodious chime echoed through the hall. A butler was gently tapping a crystal glass. The low murmur of conversation instantly ceased. "Ladies and gentlemen," the butler announced, his voice projecting easily, "Mr. Sterling would like to say a few words before dinner is served in the conservatory." The crowd parted respectfully as Silas Sterling stepped up onto the lower stair of the grand staircase. He smiled warmly, a rare expression for the notorious recluse. "Friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests," Silas began, his voice a rich baritone. "I host this gathering every year to celebrate human ingenuity. Many of you in this room have built companies that changed how we communicate, how we travel, and how we live. But tonight, I am not interested in the future." He paused, letting the silence hang. Taylor shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a good lead-in for a tech fund pitch. "Tonight," Silas continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, "I want to celebrate the past. And more importantly, the brilliant minds that preserve it. For a century, my family has possessed a document that defied all logic. A historical riddle that mocked every cryptographer, every historian, and every supercomputer we threw at it." Murmurs of intrigue rippled through the elite crowd. "2 weeks ago, I sought out a specialist," Silas said, his voice lowering with reverence. "I sent this puzzle to a woman whose reputation in the academic underground is nothing short of legendary. A woman of unparalleled intellect, relentless focus, and profound grace. Not only did she break the cipher in 14 days, but she uncovered a piece of history that will rewrite architectural textbooks." Taylor frowned. He glanced at Chloe, who looked bored, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "It is my absolute privilege," Silas said, extending his hand towards the shadows at the top of the staircase, "to introduce my guest of honor for the evening, a woman I am proud to call a colleague, a savior of history, and my dearest new friend. Please, welcome Miss Tabitha Hayes." The name didn't compute in Taylor's brain immediately. Tabitha Hayes. Tabitha? His Tabitha? No, impossible. It was a coincidence, a trick of the acoustics. But then, she emerged into the light. The woman descending the staircase was a vision. She was draped in midnight blue silk that moved like liquid glass. Her posture was regal, her chin tilted upward, her eyes sparkling with a quiet, devastating confidence. She placed her delicate, ungloved hand into Silas Sterling's waiting palm. The entire room erupted into genuine, rapturous applause. Taylor's champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 pieces, but the sound was completely drowned out by the applause. He stared, his mouth slightly open, the blood draining from his face until he felt dizzy. It was her. It was his boring, discarded, cardigan-wearing wife. Silas Sterling, the man Taylor had come to beg for money, the man who held Taylor's entire future in his hands, was looking at Tabitha as if she were the most fascinating, brilliant creature on the face of the earth. And Tabitha, standing at the apex of power in a room full of billionaires, looked completely, utterly at home. As the applause died down, Silas led Tabitha towards the dining hall. As they passed through the crowd, Tabitha's gaze briefly swept over the guests. For one terrible suspended second, her eyes locked onto Taylor's. There was no anger in her expression. There was no sadness. There was no triumph, or spite, or revenge. Worse, there was nothing. She looked at him with the polite, fleeting indifference one might reserve for a stranger's ugly coat. Then she turned away, laughing at something Silas whispered in her ear, leaving Taylor drowning in the shattered wreckage of his own arrogance. The conservatory of the Sterling estate was a masterpiece of Victorian glass and wrought iron, retrofitted with climate controls that kept rare orchids blooming year-round. Beneath a canopy of exotic flora, 3 long tables draped in heavy white linen were set with antique silver and baccarat crystal. Taylor Pendleton found his seat card near the drafty entrance to the kitchens, sandwiched between a silent, elderly philanthropist and a junior executive from a rival firm who looked just as desperate as Taylor felt. Chloe, whose red dress suddenly looked glaringly cheap under the soft, ambient lighting of the conservatory, spent the first 2 courses furiously texting under the table. At the center of the room, on a slightly elevated dais, sat the head table. It was the nexus of power. Seated there was the governor of California, the CEO of the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer, and Silas Sterling. And directly to Silas's right, holding court with a quiet, magnetic brilliance, was Tabitha. Taylor watched her over his untouched plate of seared scallops. He felt a sickening cocktail of humiliation and disbelief churning in his stomach. He watched as the CEO of the electric vehicle company, A man who had famously hung up on Taylor's boss, David Kensington, twice, leaned in, utterly captivated by whatever Tabitha was saying. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't stumbling over her words. She was gesturing elegantly with a silver fork, explaining something with the confident cadence of an expert who knew she was the smartest person in the room. "This is insane," Taylor hissed to Chloe, gripping his napkin so tightly his knuckles turned white. "She's faking it. She's a glorified librarian. She doesn't belong up there." Chloe finally looked up from her phone, her expression sour. "Well, she's up there, and you're back here next to the swinging doors. So are you going to sit here and pout, or are you going to use your leverage?" "Leverage? She was your wife for 6 years, Taylor," Chloe snapped, her eyes narrowing with calculating sharpness. "She owes you. Go up there during the intermission, act like the supportive, amicable ex-husband, and use her to get an introduction to Sterling. If you don't get Meridian Capital in front of him tonight, David is going to have your head on a pike by Monday morning." Taylor swallowed hard. The logic was flawed, built on the arrogant assumption that Tabitha still cared about his approval. But desperation is a powerful narcotic. As the waiters cleared the appetizer plates and a gentle hum of mingling began, Taylor stood up, smoothing the lapels of his Tom Ford suit. He plastered on his most charming, aggressive venture capitalist smile and began the long walk towards the dais. The security personnel hovering near the head table stepped forward as Taylor approached, but Silas Sterling waved them off with a flick of his wrist. Silas leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes fixing on Taylor with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. Tabitha was mid-conversation with the governor, discussing the preservation of indigenous artifacts in the state's northern territories, when Taylor inserted himself into their airspace. "Tabitha, sweetheart," Taylor boomed, his voice entirely too loud for the refined acoustics of the conservatory. He reached out, attempting to place a familiar, patronizing hand on her bare shoulder. Before his fingers could graze her silk dress, Tabitha subtly shifted her weight, turning just enough so that his hand caught nothing but empty air. She looked up at him. The temperature in Taylor's veins dropped by 10 degrees. "Taylor," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, devoid of the anxiety she used to carry when he raised his voice. "I see you managed to find an invitation. How resourceful." Taylor let out a forced, booming laugh, acutely aware that the governor, the tech CEO, and Silas Sterling had all stopped talking to stare at him. "Well, you know me. Never one to miss a networking opportunity. I have to say, Tabitha, I'm stunned. Playing dress-up, mingling with the heavy hitters. I didn't know you had it in you. Usually you're in bed by 9 with a dusty encyclopedia." He meant it to sound like an endearing inside joke. Instead, it hung in the air, pathetic and cruel. Silas Sterling set his wine glass down. The soft clink sounded like a gavel dropping. "And you are?" Silas asked, his tone dripping with polite venom. "Taylor Pendleton, Mr. Sterling," Taylor said, pivoting quickly to his target, thrusting his hand forward. "Senior Director at Meridian Capital. We sent you a prospectus regarding the new infrastructure fund." "I don't shake hands during dinner, Mr. Pendleton," Silas interrupted, not moving an inch. Taylor's hand hovered awkwardly in the air before he slowly pulled it back. "And I am well aware of who you are. The prospectus you sent was rudimentary at best, and deeply derivative at worst. But more importantly, I am aware of your connection to Dr. Hayes." Taylor blinked, thrown off balance. "Dr. Hayes?" He had always mocked Tabitha's PhD in archival cryptography as a useless piece of paper. "Yes," Tabitha interjected smoothly, her eyes locked on Taylor's. "Dr. Hayes, the title you spent 6 years telling me was too pretentious to use in polite company." "Tabitha, Taylor stammered, the venture capitalist facade cracking. "I just wanted to say congratulations. And you know, since we have history, I thought perhaps we could bridge a connection between Meridian and the Sterling Foundation." Tabitha tilted her head, a small, terrifyingly calm smile playing on her lips. "Bridge a connection?" Taylor, you spent our entire marriage burning bridges because you thought my side of the river wasn't profitable enough. You told your colleagues I was an anchor weighing down your ascent." She didn't raise her voice, but every word was a surgical strike. "You are not here to support me. You are here because you are a parasite looking for a new host, and I am no longer bleeding." The silence at the table was absolute. The CEO of the electric vehicle company let out a low, impressed whistle. Taylor's face burned a violent shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to assert dominance, to do what he had always done, make her feel small. But he looked at Silas Sterling's icy glare, and then at the governor's look of utter disgust. He was a minnow who had swum into a tank of leviathans. "I think, Mr. Pendleton," Silas said quietly, "it is time for you to return to the drafty end of the room. Your companion looks like she's about to break her phone screen, and if Meridian Capital ever contacts my offices again, I will personally ensure your firm is audited by every regulatory body in this state." Taylor didn't remember the walk back to his table. He didn't remember the rest of the dinner. All he felt was the crushing, suffocating weight of his own insignificance. Monday morning in San Francisco brought a thick, oppressive fog that mirrored the atmosphere inside the glass-walled boardroom of Meridian Capital. Taylor sat at the long mahogany table, nursing a catastrophic hangover and a profound sense of dread. Across from him sat David Kensington, the senior partner, drumming his gold pen against a leather folio. The rest of the executive team was present, their eyes fixed on Taylor. "So," David began, his voice dangerously soft, "the Sterling Solstice Gala, the most exclusive room on the West Coast. I assume, Taylor, since you begged me to front the political capital to get you that +2, you have a term sheet signed by Silas Sterling in your briefcase." Taylor cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. It felt like a noose. "David, the situation with Sterling is complex. The man is eccentric. He doesn't respond to traditional pitches. I made contact, but he requires a more delicate approach. We need to pivot our strategy." "Pivot?" David stopped drumming the pen. "Taylor, we don't have time to pivot. Our Q3 numbers are in the gutter. The entire structural integrity of this new fund relies on securing a whale like Sterling to signal to the rest of the market that we are viable. If we don't land him, we lose the Valley Ridge data center contract. If we lose the data center contract, we are insolvent by December." "I understand that, David, but—" Taylor was interrupted by the sharp buzz of the boardroom's secure intercom. The receptionist's voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Kensington? I apologize for interrupting, but there is a courier here from Blackwood and Associates. They represent the Sterling Trust. They insist on handing a parcel directly to you." The boardroom collectively held its breath. David's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "Send them in." A severe-looking man in a grey suit entered the room, handed David a thick, sealed dossier, and exited without a word. David sliced open the envelope, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "You see, Taylor," David gloated, pulling out a stack of heavy, watermarked documents. "This is why I tolerate your aggressive style. You actually got through to the old bastard. Let's see what the terms are." David's voice trailed off as he read the first page. His triumphant smile curdled into a mask of pure confusion, and then, slowly, twisted into absolute horror. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his eyes scanning the dense legal text frantically. "David?" Taylor asked, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "What is it?" David slowly looked up. If looks could physically eviscerate a man, Taylor would have been bleeding on the boardroom floor. "This isn't a term sheet," David whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "This is a cease and desist order, accompanied by a patent infringement lawsuit." The room erupted into chaos. Executives grabbed at the pages as David threw them onto the table. "Infringement?" Taylor stammered, standing up. "That's impossible. Our proprietary cooling tech for the Valley Ridge data centers was developed in-house. It's entirely original." "Read the addendum, you idiot!" David roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany. Taylor grabbed the back pages of the dossier. Attached to the legal threats were high-resolution copies of ancient, weathered schematics. They were intricate, hand-drawn diagrams of a subterranean aqueduct and airflow system, accompanied by notes written in a bizarre, jagged cipher. But below the cipher was a clean, modern translation, printed in crisp Arial font, translated and authenticated by Dr. Tabitha Hayes. Taylor's vision blurred. The text detailed a passive geothermal cooling system designed by a 15th century architect, a system identical in every thermodynamic principle to the proprietary technology Meridian Capital was claiming to have invented. "Silas Sterling," David read from the legal summary, his voice dead and hollow, "has successfully filed an injunction against Meridian Capital, proving that our underlying technology is derived from a historical blueprint in the public domain, specifically the Vesper Codex. A blueprint that he now legally controls the modern application rights to through a newly formed entity." David looked at the final page, his jaw clenching so hard it looked painful. "The CEO and majority shareholder of this new entity is Dr. Tabitha Hayes." Taylor collapsed back into his chair. The air was sucked out of his lungs. Tabitha hadn't just humiliated him at a dinner party. She had systematically dismantled his career. By breaking the Vesper Codex, she had uncovered the original historical proof that Meridian Capital's entire tech portfolio was a fraud. "She found the flaw," Taylor whispered to himself, the reality crushing him like a physical weight. "She didn't just read the book, she weaponized it." David Kensington stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with trembling hands. "You told me your ex-wife was a boring, insignificant librarian, Taylor." "She was. She is," Taylor pleaded, his voice cracking. "She is the architect of our bankruptcy," David spat. "Sterling's legal team is demanding a full audit of our R&D department to prove we plagiarized the thermodynamic models. When the board finds out about this, they won't just fire us, Taylor. They will refer us to the SEC for defrauding our initial investors." David walked toward the boardroom door, pausing just before he exited. He didn't look back at Taylor. "Clean out your desk, Pendleton. Security will escort you out in 15 minutes. If I ever see your face in the financial district again, I will personally run you over." An hour later, Taylor found himself standing on the cold, grey sidewalk of Market Street, holding a single cardboard box containing his framed degrees and a titanium coffee mug. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Chloe. "Saw the news on Bloomberg. Sorry, babe, but I can't be associated with a sinking ship. My PR firm represents winners. Best of luck with the SEC." Taylor looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers of San Francisco, the monuments of wealth and power he had sacrificed everything to conquer. He had traded a brilliant, loyal woman for an illusion of status, believing he was the mastermind of his own destiny. Now the city felt like a massive, impenetrable fortress, and he was locked on the outside, completely alone, holding a cardboard box of worthless trophies. Somewhere, in a beautiful sunlit office in Carmel by the sea, Tabitha Hayes was likely poring over another ancient manuscript, rewriting history, and completely forgetting that Taylor Pendleton ever existed. 6 months later, the tech landscape of Silicon Valley had fundamentally shifted, and the epicenter of the earthquake was a woman who used to spend her weekends meticulously cataloging 17th century botanical prints. Tabitha Hayes was no longer just Silas Sterling's favorite guest. She was his equal. Together, they had founded Vespera Innovations, a firm dedicated to reverse engineering lost historical technologies for modern, sustainable applications. By legally proving through the United States Patent and Trademark Office that the core of Meridian Capital's revolutionary cooling systems was actually stolen from the Vesper Codex, Tabitha had effectively secured a monopoly on a billion-dollar green tech sector. The media dubbed her the historian who hacked the future. She was featured on the cover of Forbes and invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Real-world institutions that had previously ignored her freelance emails, like the Smithsonian and the Stanford University archives, were now begging for her consultation on their unclassified vaults. Tabitha walked through the pristine, glass-walled corridors of Vespera's new headquarters in Palo Alto, flanked by a team of structural engineers and cryptographers. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and trousers, her hair clipped back efficiently, exuding a quiet, terrifying competence. Dr. Hayes, her lead engineer, a brilliant MIT graduate named Thomas, jogged to keep up with her. The Department of Energy just approved the beta test for the aqueduct filtration system. We're cleared to break ground in Nevada. Excellent, Tabitha said, not breaking her stride. Ensure the environmental impact report is cross-referenced with the indigenous land treaties from 1863. I will not have this company repeating the arrogant mistakes of the standard tech bros. We build with history, not over it. She entered her corner office, a sprawling space that smelled of expensive espresso and old parchment. On her desk sat a genuine first-edition copy of a Galileo manuscript, a gift from Silas to celebrate their first billion in valuation. As she sat down, her executive assistant, a sharp woman named Beatrice, hovered in the doorway. Dr. Hayes, your 2 o'clock is here. But there's a problem in the lobby. Security is holding a man who is aggressively insisting on speaking with you. He bypassed the outer perimeter by claiming he was a former consultant for the Codex project. Tabitha frowned, pulling up the lobby security feed on her monitor. Standing between 2 burly security guards, looking haggard, disheveled, and completely broken, was Taylor Pendleton. He had aged 10 years in 6 months. His bespoke Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled, off-the-rack grey jacket that hung loosely on his diminished frame. The SEC investigation had gutted him. Meridian Capital had dissolved into bankruptcy, and David Kensington had thrown Taylor under the bus, naming him the sole architect of the intellectual property theft. Taylor's bank accounts were frozen. His luxury loft had been repossessed, and Chloe had blocked his number the day the federal subpoenas arrived. Tabitha stared at the screen for a long, quiet moment. There was no spike of adrenaline, no gloating joy, just a cold, scientific curiosity, like watching an insect trapped under glass. "Send him up, Beatrice," Tabitha said softly. "Have security wait right outside the door." When the heavy, brass-studded oak doors of Tabitha's top-floor office swung open, the silence inside was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, methodical ticking of a 19th-century grandfather clock standing in the corner. The room was a sprawling sanctuary of power, flooded with the golden afternoon light of Palo Alto. It smelled of expensive espresso, lemon oil polish, and the faint, unmistakable scent of ancient parchment. Taylor Pendleton did not walk into the room. He practically stumbled, his dress shoes scuffing against the hand-woven Persian rug. The man who stood before Tabitha was a ghost of the arrogant venture capitalist who had once toasted to her irrelevance. The physical toll of his 6-month freefall was shocking. His skin, once artificially tanned from weekend golf retreats, was now a sickly, pallid grey. The bespoke Tom Ford suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting, off-the-rack polyester jacket that hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. There were dark, bruised bags under his eyes, and his hands trembled violently as he clutched a crumpled manila folder to his chest. Tabitha did not stand up. She did not flinch. She sat behind a massive desk carved from reclaimed mahogany, wearing a flawlessly tailored navy blue blazer. Her posture was impeccable. She slowly capped her fountain pen, placing it deliberately beside a genuine, first-edition Galileo manuscript, and looked up at him. Her expression was not one of anger, nor was it triumphant. It was the terrifying, sterile curiosity of a scientist observing a deeply flawed experiment. "Tabitha," Taylor choked out, his voice hoarse and brittle, as if he hadn't had a glass of water in days. "Dr. Hayes," Tabitha corrected, her voice as smooth and unyielding as polished obsidian, or, if we must observe corporate formalities, Madam CEO. I no longer answer to the name you used to summon me to pick up your dry cleaning. Taylor swallowed hard, a pathetic, wet sound in the quiet room. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes darting frantically around the opulent office, taking in the priceless historical artifacts and the framed patent certificates hanging on the wall. He looked like a man standing at the gallows, hoping the executioner might suddenly develop a sense of humor. "I know I have no right to be here," Taylor began, his voice cracking. He wrung his hands together, the manila folder bending under his grip. "I know what you think of me, but I have nothing left. Meridian Capital is gone. David Kensington threw me to the wolves. The SEC froze my accounts, they seized my car, and now the Department of Justice is moving forward with criminal fraud charges. I am facing 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, Tabitha. I can't even afford a public defender who understands corporate law." "A tragic sequence of events," Tabitha observed mildly, leaning back in her plush leather chair and steepling her fingers. "But entirely predictable. A structure built on a foundation of intellectual theft will inevitably collapse when subjected to the stress test of reality. It is a basic principle of both architecture and morality." "Please," Taylor begged, tears of pure self-pity welling in his bloodshot eyes. He closed the distance, stopping just short of her desk as the shadow of a security guard shifted in the hallway outside. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to beg for my life. John Runyon, you hold the patent now. You and Silas Sterling control the modern application rights to the Vesper Codex." He hastily opened the crumpled folder, pulling out a thick, legally binding document marked with red tags. His hands shook so badly the paper rattled. "This is an affidavit," Taylor pleaded, pushing the document across the smooth surface of her desk. "If you just sign this, stating that Meridian Capital's thermodynamic cooling designs were an unintentional parallel discovery, a historical coincidence, the DOJ will drop the criminal charges. They'll reduce it to a civil penalty. I'll still be bankrupt, but I won't go to prison. I'm begging you, just a signature." Tabitha didn't even look at the document. She kept her cool, penetrating gaze fixed entirely on his face. "A coincidence," Tabitha repeated, testing the word on her tongue. "You want me to commit perjury by swearing that a group of Silicon Valley finance bros accidentally reinvented a specific, highly complex, 15th century subterranean aqueduct system down to the exact mathematical ratios used by a rogue Renaissance architect?" "People have identical ideas all the time," Taylor cried out, his voice pitching higher in desperation. "It could happen. It's plausible doubt." "Taylor," Tabitha sighed, a soft, weary sound that cut deeper than any scream. "You always thought I was oblivious. You thought because I was quiet at your dinner parties, because I didn't engage in your shallow corporate blood sports, that I wasn't paying attention. But an archivist's entire job is to observe the details that others overlook." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "When Silas brought me the Vesper Codex and I translated the blueprints for that cooling system, I immediately recognized the thermodynamic equations. Do you know why? Because for 3 years I sat across from you at our kitchen table while you loudly bragged on the phone about Meridian's proprietary tech. You left your company's preliminary design briefs on the kitchen counter. I absorbed every flawed, stolen metric of your company's fraud while I was pouring your morning coffee." Taylor's face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks until he looked like a corpse. "I didn't just accidentally discover your theft, Taylor," Tabitha said, her voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper. "I mapped your company's patents directly against the historical record. I meticulously built the legal trap that caught you, because I knew your firm's arrogance would blind you to the source material. You didn't fall. I demolished you." Taylor's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, a pathetic heap of ruined ambition. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged, ugly sob. "I was your husband," he wailed, the sound muffled by his palms. "We stood at an altar. We promised for better or for worse. Doesn't those 6 years mean anything to you? How can you be this cold?" "Those 6 years meant a great deal," Tabitha replied, entirely unmoved by his tears. "They were a grueling masterclass in endurance. You spent 6 years systematically trying to erase my personality. You told me my passions were boring. You demanded I shrink myself, mute my intellect, and fade into the beige wallpaper so your fragile, mediocre ego could cast a larger shadow. You discarded me at a penthouse party, Taylor, while your friends laughed and toasted to my irrelevance as if I were a broken appliance." She paused, letting the silence of the room press down on him. "I am not cold," she continued softly. "I am simply mirroring the exact amount of empathy you showed me on the day you handed me divorce papers. You told me then that I was an anchor weighing down your velocity. Well, look at me now. I am the ocean, and you are drowning." Taylor looked up, his face slick with tears and sweat. "I have no one," he whispered brokenly. "Chloe left me the second the subpoenas arrived. My friends won't return my calls. I am completely alone." At the mention of Chloe Sinclair, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Tabitha's lips. She reached over to a silver tray on her desk and picked up a crisp, cream-colored piece of cardstock. "Speaking of Miss Sinclair," Tabitha noted, her tone conversational, "you might be interested to know that she reached out to my executive assistant 3 weeks ago. She submitted this deeply impressive resume, applying for the position of head of public relations here at Vespera Innovations." Taylor froze, his mouth hanging open in horror. In her cover letter, Tabitha read aloud, her eyes scanning the paper with mild amusement. "She explicitly offered to spearhead a media campaign denouncing your character, framing herself as yet another innocent victim of Taylor Pendleton's toxic manipulation. She promised to leverage her Instagram following to publicly applaud your federal indictment." Tabitha dropped the resume so it fluttered down, landing perfectly on Taylor's trembling lap. "She is quite the opportunistic parasite," Tabitha mused. "Though naturally I rejected her application. Vespera Innovations does not employ bottom feeders." Taylor stared at the resume, the final illusion of his glamorous, fast-paced life shattering into microscopic fragments. He had traded a loyal, brilliant partner for a woman who was actively trying to profit off his incarceration. The sheer weight of his own profound stupidity pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. "Please," Taylor whispered, a final, breathless surrender. He pressed his forehead against the floor. "Just give me a crumb of mercy. I'll do anything. I'll clean the floors of this building. I'll disappear. Just don't let me go to a cell." Tabitha stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. She walked around the massive desk, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor surrounding the rug. She stopped just a few feet from where Taylor groveled. "There is one final piece of business to discuss," Tabitha said. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a sleek smartphone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it down toward him. Taylor slowly lifted his head. Through his blurred vision, he looked at the screen. It displayed a digital property deed, stamped with the official seal of the city of San Francisco. "The bank officially foreclosed on your beloved Soma penthouse last month," Tabitha stated, her voice devoid of any triumph, functioning purely as a deliverer of facts. "It went to a blind public auction yesterday morning. Vespera Innovations acquired it for a fraction of its market value." Taylor blinked, confusion cutting through his panic. "You bought my apartment? The penthouse? Why? To live in it just to spite me?" "Heavens, no. I have a beautiful estate in Carmel," Tabitha said, a look of genuine distaste crossing her features. "I bought it because Vespera recently acquired a massive shipment of heavily decayed 18th-century tax ledgers and records of failed mercantile ventures. We needed a secure, off-site, climate-controlled storage facility to house documents belonging to ruined, forgotten men. She looked down at him, her eyes flashing with cold, hard justice. Your glass walls and high-tech security system were perfectly adequate for storage. But don't worry, Taylor. I had my contractors completely gut the place. We ripped out the marble wet bar you loved so much, tore up the imported hardwood, and stripped the master bedroom down to the concrete to make room for rows of metal filing cabinets. The monument to your ego is now literally a dusty warehouse for my archives. Taylor let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. It was the ultimate, inescapable indignity. The very place where he had raised a glass of 20-year-old scotch to celebrate throwing her away was now a physical manifestation of his irrelevance. "You were never the engine of our lives, Taylor," Tabitha whispered, quoting the very insult his senior partner had hurled at her all those months ago. "You were just the noise, and I have completely, permanently tuned you out." Tabitha turned her back on him, walking calmly back to her desk. She didn't look at him again. She pressed a silver button on her intercom. "Beatrice," Tabitha said clearly, "Mr. Pendleton's meeting has concluded. Please have security escort him off the premises and alert local law enforcement that if he comes within 500 yards of this property again, I will press criminal trespassing charges." 2 massive security guards immediately stepped into the room. They didn't speak. They simply grabbed Taylor by the arms and hauled him to his feet like a sack of garbage. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream. The fight, the ego, and the arrogance had been completely and utterly drained out of him. As the guards dragged him backward towards the exit, Taylor Pendleton's final view of the corporate world was his boring ex-wife. She was already ignoring him, picking up her fountain pen, bathed in the California sunlight, sitting at the absolute apex of an empire she had built from the ashes of his hubris. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud, sealing him out in the cold forever, leaving him to face the very justice he had spent his whole life trying to outrun. Taylor's brutal downfall is a stark reminder that true brilliance doesn't need to shout to be heard, and arrogance built on a hollow foundation will always eventually collapse. Tabitha's journey from a discarded, underestimated wife to a formidable billionaire titan proves that the best revenge isn't anger. It's phenomenal, unstoppable success. She didn't just break the cipher of an ancient manuscript. She broke the invisible chains of a toxic marriage, reclaiming her genius and redefining her destiny. Sometimes, the people who are pushed into the background are exactly the ones who end up rewriting the entire story.